Welcome back to CIS. It's great to have you back. Notwithstanding all those points you made about escalation dominance and the fact that the Israelis are now bogged down in Gaza, aren't you overstating your point about Israel's grim security outlook? After all, it's not declared, but they do have nuclear weapons. And as a foreign policy realist, you would surely concede that nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent to a foreign attack. So are you being overly gloomy about Israel's security outlook?
I think there's no question, as Tom points out, that nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. And I don't think any country with nuclear weapons is going to disappear from the planet because another country attacks it. I think that no country would try to inflict a decisive defeat on Israel because it has nuclear weapons. But the problem is that Israel has an internal problem. See, Tom's point about nuclear weapons applies if you're talking about Iran hitting Israel. It's an interstate problem, okay? But Hamas is not another country. Hamas is inside Greater Israel. What Hamas is doing is executing a rebellion or executing an insurrection. And nuclear weapons don't do anything for you in that regard. To take this a step further, we've talked a little bit, just briefly, about South Africa and the fact that South Africa was an apartheid state. And basically that state that existed, apartheid South Africa, disappeared. That state had nuclear weapons. South Africa had nuclear weapons. And what you want to understand, and this is very important in the Israeli context, is that what's happening inside your society, inside your body politic, matters enormously. And nuclear weapons can't do much to protect you. You see what I'm saying? But I don't want to take away from his basic point that nuclear weapons do provide deterrence against Iran getting nuclear weapons or...
Well, I mean, many scholars would still argue that the security outlook for Israel is not as grim as you point out, not just because of their access to nuclear weapons. Let me put this to you. This is Fareed Zakaria, a CNN host who's also a columnist at the Washington Post. Now, admittedly, he said this before October 7, but let me put this to you. This is what he says. First, there is the disappearance of the Arab threat. From its first day in existence, Israel has faced the danger of extinction by Arab armies. This is the threat against which the Jewish state has planned, armed and trained for most of its national life. Today, that threat is gone. Second, the armies from Israel's main strategic adversaries, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, historically, they're in disarray, while the Israeli armed forces have become the region's superpower in a league ahead of the rest. How would you respond to Fareed Zakaria?
He's right in that sense that those traditional adversaries have effectively disappeared. When I was young and the 1956 war took place, the 1967 war took place, the 1973 war took place, these were all conflicts that involved Israel up against Arab states. And by the way, in 1948, when Israel got its independence, May 14th, 1948, yesterday was Israeli Independence Day. But
76th anniversary.
Yeah, but there's no question that the Israelis fought wars in 1948 against...
That's his point.
But that's not the threat anymore. There's a whole new set of threats called Hamas, called Hezbollah, called the Houthis.
Yep. But aren't we seeing a broader trend in the Middle East between the Iranian-backed Shia proxies that you just mentioned, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebels, versus Saudi Arabia and the Sunni Gulf states? Isn't that the broader issue? And doesn't that, to the extent that is true, help Israel? Because you've got a civil war, essentially, in the Muslim community in the Arab world.
How does it help Israel solve the Gaza problem? Explain to me how that helps Israel solve the Gaza problem. And while you're at it, explain to me how it helps solve the missile problem that Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis and Iran present to Israel.
You, like former President Jimmy Carter and the university, we've got time for questions. I want to get through it. You've called tonight Israel an apartheid state. Can't Palestinians vote?
It's important to understand that there are basically three groups of Palestinians. The Palestinians, obviously, in Gaza, who we talked about tonight, the Palestinians in the West Bank, and then the Palestinians inside of what's called Green Line Israel. That was the Israel that existed up until the 1967 war, before they captured those two territories. And when I say there's 7.3 million Palestinians in Greater Israel, that includes the Palestinians in all three of those areas. The only Palestinians who can vote are the Palestinians in Green Line Israel. The Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank cannot vote, right? So that's one point. The second point is the Palestinians in Israel do not have equal rights. There's no question they can vote, right? But they don't have equal rights. That's why I always argue that Israel is not a liberal democracy. If you want to argue Israel is a democracy, right, you can make that argument. I would even fight with you there because of the West Bank and Gaza. But let me say, I'll give you that, right, that it is a democracy. You can't make the argument that Israel is a liberal democracy because the Palestinians don't have equal rights inside Green Line Israel. This is the principal reason, in my opinion, that Israel does not have a constitution. They've moved in that direction a couple times, but they can't go too far down that road because they don't want equal rights. They want a Jewish state, not a state where Palestinians and Jews are equal in number and have equal rights.
Okay, but your critics, and they're not just Jewish leaders, a lot of people in this room presumably would say it's a stretch to compare Israel today to the old racist South Africa of yesteryear. And this is the late Les Gelb, someone you knew, the former president of the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations. Quote, "The US is helping to protect one of the few nations in the world that share American values and interests, a true democracy." And this is Richard Cohen, a longtime columnist of the Washington Post. The Israel of today and the South Africa of yesterday have almost nothing in common. In South Africa, the minority white population harshly ruled the majority black population. Non-whites were denied civil rights, and in 1958, they were even deprived of citizenship. Cohen goes on to say, in contrast, Israeli Arabs, about 1/5 of the country, have the same civil and political rights as do Israeli Jews. Arabs sit in the Knesset and serve in the military, although most are exempt from the draft. And Cohen concludes, whatever this is, and it looks suspiciously like a liberal democracy, it cannot be apartheid. Again, your response to the likes of Les Gelb and Richard Cohen.
Just very quickly, they don't have equal rights. This is the Palestinians who live inside Green Line Israel. They simply don't have equal rights. And what about the Palestinians in Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank? This is all part of Greater Israel. But let me make a couple points in addition to that. First of all, whether Israel is an apartheid state is not based on any comparison with South Africa. You have to come up with what is a definition of apartheid, and then you have to look at what's happening inside of Israel and see whether it meets that definition, right? There's no question that there are differences, and I'll get to this in a second, between apartheid in South Africa and apartheid in Israel. But the question is, what are the general characteristics of an apartheid regime, and does Israel fill the bill? Now, as I told you before, if you have any doubts about this, there are huge reports written by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights group inside of Israel, laying out the case as to why Israel is an apartheid state. And I think those three reports make a very powerful case. My final point to you is there are a number of South Africans who lived under apartheid in South Africa, including South African Jews and including Bishop Tutu, who make the argument that the apartheid system in Israel is worse than the apartheid system in South Africa.